All right, guys, we just got done talking about idle tuning and kind of how I went about it on Foxbody, on Project Foxbody 41 here. And I think what I'd like to do now, since a lot of you have asked for it, is cover a little bit of acceleration enrichment tuning. Now, because I don't have a whole lot of time to get fancy on this particular tune, I'm just using basic time-based acceleration enrichment, which, to be honest, is all I ever use on my own vehicles as well, because once it's dialed in, it works really, really well. At some point in the future, I'll get into those more advanced acceleration enrichment strategies. But let's take a quick minute and let's review what I've got set up to get a really crisp throttle response out of Foxbody 41. All right, so let's take a look at acceleration enrichment. So my basic Accel Enrich settings here are just time-based AE, and that's all I'm using is basic time-based acceleration. Now, because this vehicle has low map at idle, and because the idle is erratic, I don't want to take the chance of having acceleration enrichment improperly trigger at idle. Therefore, I've chosen to use solely throttle position-based acceleration enrichments for this particular build. So, I like to use a curve on most vehicles. I found something that looks about like this to work very, very well. Let me expand this so you can get a really good view of what we're working with and what I'm looking at here. So I like to start my acceleration enrichment at a relatively low TPS dot. Now, TPS dot is rate of change of the throttle position sensor. And even though I'm triggering at this relatively low 50% or 50% dot, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm adding a lot of fuel. This is in this system is set up as a percentage. This is not a pulse width adder. This is a percentage of the current fuel being injected added on top. Now, it's not quite that simple. We also have an amount of time that we're going to have it sit around. For simplicity, I set this one to time. Usually I use a number of ignition events. So I can say I want 20 ignition events rather than, say, 0.2 seconds. Ignition events works better for me because that means that the fuel is basically, it's going to bleed off faster in the higher RPMs because you have more ignition events. However, it also means that we can get a little bit more aggressive with those values. At higher RPMs, acceleration enrichment it's less important than especially that right off idle throttle response. So something important to note here is that if you're going to change your TPS dot here, I also change my threshold to that same value, so both of them are set to a value of 50. I do not cut fuel or use a enrichment. I leave my decel fuel value at 100%. I prefer not to remove fuel when I lift. I do that in the fuel table. I don't even use overrun fuel cut. 20 and 130 work well with pretty much every build, so I just leave them at that. On these domestic V8s, I have found that between 2,500 and 6,000, that's my tapers. So below 2,500 RPM, I want that full acceleration enrichment when I hit the throttle. And then we taper from that full enrichment at 2,500 to no enrichment at 6,000. So When we're doing these steps, I like to set them at 50, 120, 250, and 500. You can sit and play with the throttle and see, you know, how aggressive different throttle changes affect your throttle position, and try and play the how fast can I get the pedal to move game. What I've found though is that generally speaking, those big breaths of air are always going to need somewhere around 30% fuel. So whatever my highest TPS dot value is, generally I set that around 30%. And my smallest TPS dot value is generally within 5 to 10%. That changes application to application. And then the shape of the curve looks like this almost every time. As a matter of fact, I bet if we pulled up the tune for the E30, my acceleration enrichment curve will probably look fairly close to this, because this is what I've found works best, at least in the tunes that I've done over many cars. So it's going to get loud here for a minute, and let's dial in some acceleration enrichment. Now I'm going to do this at idle since it's very difficult to do this loaded on the dyno. However, what I'll do is I'll set the dyno up at steady state at around 2000 RPM, and then we'll do some tip-in tuning during steady state. All right, now what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for when I tip in, I want to see the air-fuel ratio go slightly rich. These domestic V8s like this small block Ford, when I tip in, I want to see between a half point and a full point air-fuel ratio in the rich direction. You can see that. Go rich. Notice that when I hit the throttle, we don't get a lean spike. If we get a lean spike, we may need to add a little bit more fuel. We are going rich. Now that's probably a bit excessive on that big end. Got a little bit of a lean spike there. Notice with that fuel decrease, now when I tip in, the air-fuel ratio is going slightly lean instead of rich. Let's see if we can see it instantly in the air-fuel ratio here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase this back to where we started. I could probably get some efficiency out of this by reducing the amount of tip-in fuel I have. However, from previous tuning, I can tell you that if I do remove any more fuel than I have in it right now, I'm going to start getting lean pops, even though the wideband doesn't show it. I like to tune my acceleration enrichments by feel rather than through a sensor. wants more fuel on tip in, regardless of what the sensor says. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and load the dyno at 2,000 RPM, and then we'll do a little tip in and see what it does. We can see that the air-fuel ratio went fairly rich, down into the 11s. However, that seems to be what this engine likes on those large throttle changes when it takes that big breath of air. I am going to leave it like this, and we're going to get some on-track data and then adjust from there once the driver gives me their feedback. They may say that the throttle feels a bit soggy. If it feels soggy, that lets me know that I'm going to need to back a little bit of this acceleration and turn fuel off. Now, you're not going to be able to hear me talking. I'm going to increase this to 3,000 RPM, and we're going to do this test again. So we can see from the air-fuel ratio and what the sensor feedback is telling us is that the acceleration enrichments that we currently have set are working. The throttle response feels good. It sounds good in the exhaust tone. I'm going to leave it exactly where it's at. I hope this has been helpful. All right, guys, now that all the steady state tuning is done, we've covered idle, we've covered some acceleration enrichments. What we're going to do is, the car's nice and warmed up, we're going to do some ramp pulls now. Now, because the steady state tuning was done, and I've already done a few ramps, the fuel table is pretty darn dialed in. But what I'm going to do is show you what I've been working on and kind of a bit through my process. We're going to move air-fuel ratio around a little bit. We're going to move ignition timing around a little bit. We're going to see, can we make a little bit more power today? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clear all of the auto plots that we currently have up. This way we start from fresh. We'll do a pull. We will then work on fuel first. We'll lean fuel out. We'll add fuel. We'll go 0.3 AFR from our baseline here, lean, then 0.3 AFR rich, see which direction makes more power. That'll help us decide where do we want to put the air-fuel ratio target. Then we will start working on moving our ignition timing. First, we'll decrease ignition timing and do a pull, and then we will increase ignition timing and do a pull and see what nets us the most power.